All right. Can't believe it's already Wednesday. That seems strange to me, but thank you for joining in. We're going to be doing something a little bit different this week than previous weeks. This week, I'm going to be coding live, which didn't think I was going to maybe ever do because for whatever reason, coding live just feels uncomfortable to me. But maybe it shouldn't. Besides, I'm not really sure what your experience with coding has been, whether you program yourself or have never seen someone program, but we're going to be playing around with the Twitter API today. So I'm going to just start sharing the screen here. Once I pull that up, yeah, we'll do screen 2. That's the one. Sweet, sweet. All right, so the Twitter API, I've been spending plenty of time as of late taking a look through this, dreaming up ideas, finding some interesting things to mess around with. So the Twitter API, there's two different versions. Version 2, which they're pushing everybody to use as much as possible, and then the old one, which is the 1.1 version. I had started, I guess I should make this a little bit larger so it's more easy to read. Unfortunately, I'm kind of covering it. So I made an application for access to this developer platform. Must have been over a year ago when I was thinking about playing around with the API. So fortunately, I already have an app that I can play around with the keys and all of that. And I was focused very much on the version 2 API because newer is always better, right? At the time, they really only had like the tweet volume stream, a filtered stream, and you could look at your timeline. They didn't have things like managing your tweets where you're able to actually post and delete tweets using the version 2 API. To do that stuff, you would have had to drop down into the version 1.1 API. So I didn't look a whole lot at that. What my original plan was to just take in a stream of tweets that are happening all over the world and analyze them and see if I can find some interesting patterns. But that didn't end up happening, and here we are now finally playing with it again. So the idea is this, what I'll be working towards today. Definitely not going to get to the end result. But the idea is that in the version 1.1 API, as I was looking through it in the past week, I found a very, very interesting one under the premium section, which I do have access to, called the Account Activity API. So why I was very interested in this one is it allows you to register a webhook. So for those who aren't familiar with webhooks, when you register a webhook as a developer of an application, you're basically telling Twitter, hey, when certain interesting things happen within your platform, I want you to send data to my app. So that's very different from a more common use case of an API where you're saying, hey, Twitter, I need this info, right? You're requesting info from Twitter saying, hey, tell me about my profile or tell me about all the tweets on my timeline, right? You're pulling that information from Twitter. A webhook allows you to have that information pushed to you from Twitter. So yeah, I didn't realize that they had a webhook sort of API for account activity, where some of the things that they'll send you is when you register your perhaps personal account, so in this case my account, to that webhook anytime I follow someone, unfollow someone, receive a direct message, write a tweet, get a reply to a tweet. I can have an application that I control receive a notification from Twitter about that. And that's really, really powerful because when I was looking at the Twitter API, they do have a users section to it where you could say, hey, take a look at my account and tell me who all my followers are or all the people I follow. And if you do that, you'd have this nice long list. But tomorrow, maybe I followed 3 people or 10 more people followed me or something. I would have to go through and request that list again and then do a cross comparison to say, hey, which ones are new, which ones maybe went away. It's a lot of extra processing that doesn't necessarily need to happen if Twitter can just tell me, hey, by the way, someone else followed you just now, and I can just update the list as opposed to having to have my current list, get a new list, and cross-reference them. So pretty powerful, and I wanted to play around with that. So the idea is if I have a stream of my account activity, the posts that I'm making, the direct messages that I'm getting or sending, there's an infinite, there's limitless possibilities for things that you could build that'd be useful to people who use Twitter. So some of my thoughts go directly to Azure here. Seeing how I'm also looking into Azure quite a bit. Let me zoom in here. And they have, maybe I should have just searched directly for this, but they have a few AI and machine learning offerings called under the cognitive services platform. Possibly bot services would be another good one, where you can work with language. So a very classic machine learning, I'll call it a toy example that people do when they're trying to get into machine learning is they'll use tweets and make a sentiment classifier, right? Is this a positive, neutral, or negative tweet? So you could, with all of the tweets that you make or people who reply to you or direct messages come in, you could use cognitive services. Instead of having to build up the model yourself, you could directly leverage Microsoft offerings to do that analysis for you. So you don't even have to learn how to build up a machine learning model. You can just leverage off-the-shelf services. They also have plenty of other things. So conversational language understanding, that's no, you can't help me right now, but thank you for trying. You could, in your direct messages, right? So if you're a e-commerce brand and people are consistently direct messaging you on Twitter asking about stuff, how to buy products, or if you offer certain ones, or if you're customer support and you get hopefully mostly like happy DMs coming in, but a lot of times they're complaints, right? Can we understand what a person is sending us automatically, right? So the direct message would come in, being pushed to us from the Twitter API, the webhook, and we could pass it right along to this Microsoft Azure service and say, what are they talking about in this message? Are they talking about the shirts that I'm selling, the pants that I'm selling, or do they have a service request, right? Like there's some issue with a product, right? Are they trying to find information about how to buy, or are they trying to get help with a problem? And if you're able to delineate that automatically, the moment a message comes in, you might have internal to your organization this app that lets you then route that to the appropriate person to respond to it. And what's really cool is maybe you even use that translator if English isn't the language that came in, but your main support speaks English, or vice versa. English comes in, but you have somebody who doesn't speak English that has to support. That's that's a bit of a stretch right now. Translation's getting pretty good, but I don't know if I would build a customer service organization around automated translations. So yeah, you could leverage some of this stuff. They also had, outside of the cognitive services, you might have seen Azure bot services too. I'm actually not sure if they already have a connector to like Twitter or something like that. But this is another offering from them where they have a whole framework around creating bots. So you might have, as part of your customer service application here, right? Some message comes in, you have that initial classification. They're not looking for help in purchasing. They have an issue with the product. And so it passes it to this bot that helps them with dealing with product issues. And maybe there's some initial conversations or diving down into certain categories of problems before it gets them to a person to help them. So I'm going a lot longer just talking about what you can do with this API and existing services out here, not actually coding, which is what I promised. So we'll get to the coding, but that's where I'm going with it, right? So let's play with the API. Let's get some data in, or at least interact with the API a little bit and see what it takes to get a few things done. And we're going to start working towards, let's understand when a message comes in and do something with that direct message. Or when we have a new follower, maybe we're going to right away send them a direct message saying something like, hey, thanks for following. Here's some of the best content that I've put out that users found most valuable. What else would you like to see? Or something like that to help right away engage new followers if you're looking to build influence on Twitter or something like that. So, like I said, all kinds of ideas. We definitely won't get that far on all of them. I mean, the best I think we're probably going to get is maybe to replying to a direct message or a follower with a direct message. But I think that's a bit ambitious for how much time I have set aside. So let's just get a start here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so things are a little bit easier to read. And what I use to code most often is Visual Studio Code. I started using this a couple of years ago and just absolutely love the platform for coding. I've tried using heavier IDEs, integrated development environments. I've tried using just straight up notepads and stuff like that when I was writing in C and C++. But the amount of extensions that there are for making the coding go much more smoothly is just incredible. Love the integrated terminal and all of that. So we're going to be coding in Python today. Usually when I make a Python program, I do some of the same things over and over. So I really should have a snippet for this, but I thought I'd just write it out as we go. So what you can see here on the right is a .env file. Now I have a real .env file here that contains secret information for interacting with Twitter as my app, which would be a terrible idea to expose on a live stream, because then I'd have to rotate keys. Otherwise you all can just take advantage of my app, which would be terrible. So what I have pulled up is an example env, which has the exact same definitions, just hidden content, or not actually hidden, but just to give me the structure and to remind me what I named things, basically. So the reason why I use .env files is it would be pretty easy otherwise to go, right, to define some variable that has a secret, right? This being the secret, my name is Andrew. And if you were to commit that into a code repository that gets shared with a whole bunch of people, that's going to turn into a security nightmare where it's your secret's just in plain text out there. So usually what you'll do is you'll have a git ignore, which I actually did not initialize this as a git repository. So let me quick do this. Make a git ignore, which when I commit code to this repository, it's basically saying don't commit these files. And number one is .env. I will often use MyPy for some other syntactic things, and we don't want to commit those. So now I am super safe wherever I commit. If I ever commit these files up into the repository to share them, no one's going to get the secrets. So you'd have to get the secrets in a different way, which can be much more controlled. Plenty of ways of doing that. But we do want to use those secrets that I do have stored locally here for convenience. And so what I'll pretty much always do is use a package called .env, where you can bring in this function called load.env, .environment, hence .env. If you don't already have that, you can install that package using pip, where I think it's actually called python.env. And of course, I already have it. No, I'm not going to upgrade right now. So py.env will get you that. And then I usually use this syntax at the beginning of my files. That way, if this ends up becoming part of a module as opposed to just a standalone script, there's an entry point into it that's well defined. And the very first thing we do is we want to load in that .environment. So if you have a file in here .env and you don't pass any arguments to this function, it's going to assume it pulls in the environment defined in this file .env in your local directory. So it's a convenient thing in this case that's all I have to type. If you have a more complicated repository, you might have to add some arguments to there. And to prove that we actually have something, we're going to load up that environment. And I am missing another import. If we want to do anything on the current system that the code's running on, we have to import OS for operating system. And so OS get environment, and then I have to give it the name of an environment variable because I don't actually care what's stored in this example config environment variable. That's going to be what I print out. And so let's give it a run and see what happens. And there's the secret, hello.env. I would prove to you that that's the secret, but if I pulled this file up, then you'd see all the other tokens, which I've already said would be a terrible idea. So nothing to do with the Twitter API so far, but this is a pretty standard way that I set up a project. A lot of times I'm using Docker containers, so that way I don't pollute my whole development environment here with packages that are only useful for this project as opposed to other projects. There's plenty of other resources in the Python ecosystem, like venv, virtual environments, that will let you handle that sort of environment management stuff. But especially since a lot of my things end up running in the cloud, I just find it particularly convenient to wrap my applications in a Docker container. So that way I can just push up those images and run them in the cloud and not have to worry about if it's going to run okay. Not doing that here. It's a little bit more of a complicated setup. It doesn't take too long, but I thought it'd be a bit of a waste of a time today. So if we want to play around with Twitter, we could make calls directly to their API. So you can see here, we could do api.twitter.com /to and users and go through, let's see here, where's a really good, they do have an example. Right, so I could send an HTTP request using this whole big long thing here. Or you could use a Python package called, well, I don't know what they call it, but I call it Tweepy. I'm sure it's TweePy or something like that for Python, but I'm just going to call it Tweepy. So this is sort of a convenience package here, which can abstract away a lot of things dealing directly with the API here. So they have, I'm just pulling up a reference thing on my other screen in case you're wondering why it's going blank. They've got a number of interesting convenience things where you can paginate, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes trying to figure out where I'm going here to try to keep this thing moving and on task. So let's see here. We don't need to import all, we'll just leave it like that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to pull up access to the version 2 API, which in Tweepy or TweePy, the best way to do that is to use the client object here, which then gives you access to a whole bunch of functions such as create tweet, delete tweet, unretweet, all these different things. Unfollow user, get all these users. So to do that, let's pull up our code again. We're going to do tweepy.client and give the variable a name. Now we need to pass in some parameters here because Twitter doesn't just give everybody access. I think I can do this with, I always forget what keys are used for what. So we're going to give the consumer key a guess that that's the correct one that we're supposed to be using. I could pull up the documentation, but why not just try? So now we're going to pull up the consumer secret. So we got a key and a secret, Twitter key secret. And what this should do is in the background, the client here will reach out to Twitter and say, hey, Twitter, by the way, I am this application that Andrew got approved through you. Can you give me authorization to interact with the rest of your API? And Twitter will look at this information I passed them and say yay or nay. So I don't think this is actually going to tell us if that was successful or not, but let's just make sure everything is imported and hooked up well to this point. So we have the object. Whether the object works or not, who knows? So let's figure out what the first thing we should call to make sure that we do actually have access to this. I think how I'm going to do that is I am going to get my own user account here and get a follower count. I think that sounds like a good low effort thing to do. Do they have a follower count? Counts, tweet counts. I don't think that's it. So we'll just look at users, IDs, pass in an ID and get a tweet. Yep, so that's what we'll do. We'll just get my tweets. Sounds like a plan. So this is the direct documentation from Twitter on their API, but if we want to use Tweepy, we can use this get users tweets, which again, I probably have to zoom in so it's legible. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go client.get tweets, and I need to pass in a list of IDs. I thought I could just pass in a user ID, not a tweet ID list. Oh, you know what? It's not get tweets, it's get user tweets. That's what it is. Yes, now we're on track again. So when we pass in which user we want to get it for, we need to pass in an ID, either as an integer or a string. I happen to know my Twitter ID. I could get this Twitter ID by doing, you know what? Maybe that would have been a good thing to do. Get user ID, get user by username. You know what? Let's give that a shot. Let's do get user, and we're going to do username equals AJ which is mine. And we're going to do user equals that, and we're just going to print what it gives us back. Unauthorized. Should have known. See, this is why we test early, to make sure that we're passing them the right information instead of coding for like an hour and then finding out it doesn't work. So instead, we're going to try just using the bearer token. Get environment Twitter bearer token. These are all things that I stored in the .env file ahead of time. So again, I wouldn't expose these secrets on a live stream. Let's see if this works. Boom, there we go. So bearer token is what they want me to pass in at this point. So you can see we got a response object here that has a data field containing a user object. And you can see I have indicated my name is Andrew Hoekstra to Twitter, and my ID is this. And you'll notice, voila, there actually is my Twitter ID that I said I knew before. But in case you didn't know your Twitter ID, here's how you can get it. So let's use that object now and say user ID is actually, you know what, we're going to rename this so I remember it's a response object. And we're going to take user response and grab the data field from it, which should be a user object. And let's just print that user object to make sure that I am unpacking this structure correctly. Yes. I know it's only saying AJ Hoekstra, but that's because I believe the user object's default method of printing itself is to just print the username. I think we're going to verify that by saying user object ID here, and we'll see if that prints out the correct ID. So I am a big fan of moving a little bit more slowly, but checking as you go along, because you can save yourself a ton of code refactoring by just checking along the way. So this is how we're going to extract the ID that we need to get user tweets here. So now, I believe this is going to be a response object as well. So now we can say, you know what, I'm going to clean this up right now. Instead of saying user object here, I'm just going to say user response data ID. So we've loaded up the environment. We got client access to the Twitter API. We used that client to look up a user by username, getting a response. And then we use that response, extract out data, specifically the user's ID. And we use that ID in the client access to get user tweets, which should pop out in this structure here. And let's take a look at what that response looks like. Woo, that's a lot of text being printed out. So there are plenty of things, options that we can pass in on here. One of them being, I think, like max tweets to return. So let's actually quick pull up that documentation because I don't want to overwhelm things. Max results, that's what it's called. So I'm going to say going forward, let's just return, yeah, let's just do let's do 5 tweets. That way we just don't get a massive amount. one thing to note, this API endpoint asking for user tweets is limited to 15 calls every 15 minutes. So as long as I don't mess up too much, too often, we aren't going to get locked out of this for 15 minutes, because that would be a disaster if I can't even call it because I'm hitting it too frequently. So let's see here. We do have the printed out Twitter or tweet response. In this case, it's a similar structure where the response has a data field to it. And within that, the contents of that field is a list indicated by these square braces. So data, if I were to unpack this, say Twitter response.data, this is going to end up being a list of tweet objects. And so we can see each of these tweet objects have an ID field, which might be useful for referencing the tweet in other parts of the program. You've got the text associated with that tweet. There's all kinds of things you can add to this. If we just take a look at the API here, you can add in tweets lookup. You can pass in all sorts of things. So you could use the tweet ID and like make another call, or you can add like enrichments to your original call, expansions they call them, where if the tweet happens to be a poll, it'll export a whole bunch of poll related data. If it's a video or other imagery, it'll give you information around that, location information, who it was in a reply to. So there's a lot of, oh, and beyond that, there's fields, right? So like if it is a video, how long is the video? What's the height and width? Metrics associated with it. The place has a whole bunch of info. So like you can add in a bunch of options to all your calls to really enrich the data that comes back as a response. But we're just going to stick to really simple stuff for now. So if this is a list, instead of printing off a list of things, I'm going to iterate through it. So for tweet in tweet response data, so this response object, we're going to extract out this data field, which is a list, and this syntax here for tweet in some list means it's going to iterate through that list, and we can just print each tweet then. So let's see if I've got this right so far. Yep, there we go. So what it seems to do is just like with the user, when we printed the user object, it defaults to just printing the username instead of all the other data associated with it. In this case, a tweet's default, the tweet object, defaults to just printing the text, as opposed to what we see the first time I ran it, where there's also a tweet ID as well. So this is the text associated with my latest 5 tweets, which for fun, if you wanted a quick read through it, has to do with business model innovation. So you probably remember that from last week when I was talking a little bit about how I use Twitter and what I tend to post. So proof that it's my account, I guess. I guess that's why I bring it up. Let's see here. All right. So I all of a sudden realized I hadn't looked at the live streaming platform that I use to see, one, if people are asking questions, which would be terrible to ignore you all. But 2, how terrible would it be if I found out I've been on mute this whole time, or you couldn't see the screen that I thought you could? That'd make for very terrible live streaming. But it seems like I'm doing okay. So we're good, and we'll keep moving forward. So here is how we're extracting out, say, the top 5 or the latest 5 tweets that a particular user, in this case me, AJ Hookst, has tweeted. So I'm going to pull up somebody I follow here just to show flexibility a bit. And for fun, I'm going to use Speak to Web. This is someone who so on the last stream or two, one of the people who interacted while it was live was talking about their company who has a platform for voice assistance for search on websites. And so they're my most recent follower. So I guess as a thank you or whatever, or convenience, I'm going to use Speak to Web as the username and see what their latest 5 tweets are. So when I run this, there we go. There are the latest 5 tweets that the account with the username Speak to Web has made. And you can see some of these start off with the @ symbol. So they're a reply to another user. So we could even have fun with this and say, I don't know who this person is, but let's get their latest 5 tweets. So this is one of the reasons why I absolutely love Twitter as a platform, is because all of this information is public. You could make a web scraper to go through, find these accounts, grab their text. APIs can make that a lot easier, so you don't have to deal with like finding the information on the page, and whenever that changes, all your stuff breaks. But I also can just use the API here and grab all of the public information without necessarily having to reach out to all these people and say, hey, do you mind if I scrape your profile for information? It's already public out there. It's sort of an implied consent by tweeting that you can do this. And Twitter highly promotes within the developer API that this is a really good platform for scraping information. They make a lot of things available to educational programs who are looking to make the world a better place through Twitter data. So yeah, you can scrape tweets from anybody. By doing it through the API, you're limited to the API limits that Twitter puts on there. So I mentioned I can't run this program more than 15 times every 15 minutes as it's currently written, because they have to ensure that everybody has good access to the API. If they just let everybody hammer their API with requests, so that's the trade-off. You have to work within Twitter's bounds, right? Instead of just making your own scraper. So I prefer using APIs. They're cleaner. Yes, there's some limitations, but you're working within the bounds of being a good team player with everybody else. And I think if people use APIs appropriately in general, more companies are going to be willing to share the data that they have available. So yeah, so that's where we're at. So why I recommend, especially at the beginning and most definitely during prototyping, to use the package Tweepy, or there's a few other ones that do similar things. Pagination. So in case you're not familiar with pagination, let's say we're trying to scrape tweets from an account that has tweeted 1 million times, right? In theory, if you wanted to get all 1 million tweets, it wouldn't make sense from a systems perspective to take in the request of, hey, give me all of the tweets of this user, and to have the backend crunch and collect all this million of tweets and send it back to you in one big response. The odds that that sort of response would be successful and at a reliable scale is basically 0. So the solution is to paginate, and what that means is they set a maximum number of tweets that they will return in one response. In terms of the Twitter API, that happens to be 1,000, I think. Oh, hey, this endpoint you can actually request 900 times. So we're definitely not going to exceed that limit unless I code something really, really poorly. But that's not the endpoint we're using. We're under the user endpoint. So let me make sure I'm pulling up the right ones. Oh, and I'm also doing this on the wrong screen, so you can't see. Classic. So here we are, get user tweets. Instead of looking at Twitter's raw documentation, I'm looking at Tweepies. Yeah, max results. You can go up to 100 per response. Default is 10. So even if somebody had 200 tweets, if you wanted to get them all, you can only get back 100 at a time. So how do you tell Twitter you want all of them, and how do you get all those responses? Well, what you do is you say, hey, go get all of them, right? You say, I want a list of all of them, and Twitter will only respond back with the first 100. But they're also going to give you a pagination token, which is... It'll appear mostly like random data, but the idea here is you can then say, okay, thank you for the initial results. I'm going to take this pagination token, and when I call get users tweets again, I'm going to pass back that pagination token and say, here's how far you got with my original request, right? Like this token tells you, it's like a save point, right? Like this is how far you got last time. You only gave me the first 100. Can you give me the next 100? And Twitter can use that token internally and go, oh, okay, they want the next page of results. Like if you go to Google search and you see the first page of results, well, clicking on page 2 is the same sort of thing. Now they're going to send you the next 100. And then you can pass that next token that they give you on that second request to get the third 100 results. So you could manage this manually, right? So what we could do here is take a look at this tweet response. I'm going to just scroll up here and see if they have it. Yeah, see right here, there's a next token field included in the metadata of our tweet response. So what I could do is after I print off these tweets, I could go and do next tweet response equals client.get users tweets. We're going to pass in an ID, which now that we're using this more than once, I'm really tempted, or what I usually will do is do this, right? Once you use something more than once, don't repeat yourself. Oop, oop, oop. But we're also going to pass in... All right, how does this method expect us to use a pagination token? Let's look at the documentation on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because there's a much better solution to this. Yeah, it's pagination token. Why did that not come up under the autocomplete? Maybe that's just under, oh, it's under params. So we can pass in that pagination token by saying, hey, tweet response dot metadata, right? So this is the end of that tweet array here. So they also have an includes field, an errors field, and a meta field. So we want to extract from that meta field so that meta is a dictionary. That's the curly braces in Python. And so this is metadata is a set of key value pairs, and we care about the key value pair labeled next token. And what we should be able to do with this is tweet response.data next tweet response.data. That would have been unfortunate if I forgot that. Not the end of the world, but there we go. So what did I write here? Basically, this mimics what we have up here, right? So if I highlight it, you can see it finds another match down here. We're doing the exact same thing. So initially, we're going to say 5 tweets at a time. Let's actually copy that over too. Get me up to 5 tweets from this user ID, and then we're going to iterate through that list and print off the tweets. And then as soon as we're done, right, we've printed all 5 of those tweets, because that's all we've asked Twitter to give us, we say, great, we have the latest 5 tweets, client, Twitter API, but now I want the next 5 from the same user. So let's remind you who the user is, tell you that we want 5 more, and say, here's where we left off, right? So you already gave me the first 5. I want the next 5 that come after where our save point was, right? And so then we pass them that token that proves, or not proves, but like indicates to Twitter where we left off. And then we're going to print all those off. So I'm going to switch this back to my account and let's run it. So how many did it print off? We have, just like before, it started off with the Nike example. And we went through polytetrafluoroethylene, also known as Teflon. And then, yeah, we didn't get down to ingredient branding or any of my conversation with CT the Disruptor before, so we did print off more tweets. If we wanted to prove this, which I think this is sufficiently convoluted enough that we could, or would be good to. Oh, you know what? We're going to do a trick. We're going to do a really cool Python feature where you can just wrap a list with enumerate. And what that does is it also gives you an index value along with the tweet. And instead of actually printing off the tweet, I'm going to print off a string that says first group and print off the index of the tweet. So that should prove that it should print out first group 1, first group 2, first group 3, all the way up to the first group 5. And we'll do the same thing down here where we enumerate, and that gives us an index. And here we'll put in second group. So this is just to prove to ourselves that we are doing what we think we're actually doing, for the sake of correctness early on before we go too much farther. So now if I run this, as long as everything works how I think it should, you can see we've got first group 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course, because Python's 0 indexed, I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 earlier, but it starts at 0. And second group 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So what this doesn't prove is that this underlying data is actually the same, right? So I could use the old list and it would print the same thing, implying that it's the same. But we can prove to ourselves here real quick that it is actually different, by looking at any other ideas was what the last thing was printed last time. And when we did this originally, just printing off the first 5, we landed on, there are lots of ways to make this a win-win. And I bet you we can find this in this latest printout. Maybe. I don't know. I believe it's correct. You can debate me in the comments if you want, but this is enough for me to say it's correct. Oh, let's experiment with something. Let's say the second time we actually want 10 tweets instead of just 5. Can we change this max results on every call? Looks like we can. At least evidence that we can. Excuse me. All right, so let's get rid of this indexing stuff that we used to just prove a few things to ourselves. Let's print this tweet out again. So why am I showing this? So you could manually go through, right? And instead of using get users tweets, you could make actual calls, HTTP requests, posts and gets to the API client directly. But using TweetP is a little bit more convenient and readable. And again, we could iterate through all these pages of results manually if we wanted to. However, another advantage of using this TweetP library is they have a paginator. So let's look up what that looks like once I find it. Pagination. We're using the second version of the API. So now, instead of using these two requests here, we can, I'm going to just comment it out so we've got it for reference. We can instead say, hey, client, the Tweepy client, give me a paginator, right? Nope, it's Tweepy. It's not a client. Yeah, because client's the Twitter API. Tweepy, give me a paginator, and I want you to use the client and the get users tweet method. Now, normally, as you can see here, we're passing in things to that parameters to that function. In this case, paginator isn't expecting whatever that function might return. It just needs to know the actual function. So we don't have to, or we shouldn't, make this an actual function call. It's just a reference to the function. And then I'm going to do this in my normal organization here. I like to break out lines a lot. Then we have to pass it the arguments, right? So in there, there's these keyword arguments that are a dictionary, and we're passing in an ID, which is user ID. And we're also passing in max results of 5. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a paginator which does this behavior for us, right? So if we pull information out of this paginator, this is an iterator, right? So we can iterate through it with the same sort of for tweet in iterator syntax that we did before, because a list can be treated like an iterator. So we can say for tweet of this user, for every tweet of this user, do something. And what's really cool is we don't have to handle the situation where we reach the end of the page, copy out that pagination token, pass it back in to get the next set of results. We can just let the paginator take care of that for us. So for tweet in tweepy.paginator, you know what? I'm going to clean this up even more. For tweet in paginator, print tweet. Now, something's going to happen here because, like I said before, you're limited to 15 calls every 15 minutes with this particular endpoint. So what that means is I have more than 15 times 5 tweets, which would be 75 tweets. I have more than 75 tweets, so it's going to make that initial call, get the first 5 tweets. It's going to make a second call, get the next 5 tweets. I'm going to very quickly make all 15 allowed calls before the minute is up. And so once I do those 15 calls, that 16th call, or since I've already done some, maybe within the last 15 minutes will be fewer than that. But once I make the one more call than I'm allowed to, this is going to come back with a response saying, hey, you've been rate limited. There is no information for you that we're going to give. You have to wait to make some more calls. So that kind of stinks. And if you don't code this well, this iterator might just keep hammering that API over and over, trying to get more data, which if you keep doing that, Twitter's going to eventually go, hey man, you're abusing this API. We're canceling your app. You can't use this anymore. So this is such a common occurrence that Tweepy, once again, has a very wonderful part to their client object that you make, where you can pass in a parameter, a Boolean, wait on rate limit. So we're going to do that. We're going to go back up to our client here, and we're going to pass in wait on rate limit and set it to true. So what this is going to do, and why Tweepy is so handy for this, is instead of having to get a response back, copy a pagination token, check to see if we've been asking too much of the API, and if not, pass in the token, and if so, wait. and then pass in the token when it's ready. Tweepy will handle all of it for us if we configure it correctly. So now I can just run this as cleanly as this and say, hey, paginator, go get me tweets. And by the way, if it rate limits you, just wait, handle the pagination token internally and pass it when it's time. So I don't have to worry about that as a developer. So for proof of concept and exploring stuff and moving quickly, definitely the way to go with this sort of approach. Once you start building a much bigger scalable system, you might want to have some custom handling, in which case you're going to start diving down farther and farther into the raw API, but that's not what we're doing here today. So let's see if I got this right. If I run this, nope, missing a positional argument. So I guess ID can't be a keyword argument. It has to be a positional argument. So if I need to pass that in, I believe it's just args equals pass in some sort of tuple to represent the positional arguments. The first one is the user ID. And because we're only passing in one positional argument and this needs to be a tuple, in Python, you have to make sure you have that comma trailing the first one. Otherwise, it thinks, oh, you're just putting this in braces, so we're going to implicitly delete it. Now it's no longer a tuple. So fun things dealing with that. Let's try this now. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. Get user tweets. Let's see here. I'm going to pull up the documentation and see what I am missing here. Args, positional arguments to pass. Oh, fun. Very interesting. So apparently this uses the features of Python where I don't actually have to wrap it in this args and keyword args. I can literally just pass them in like they are the actual arguments to the function. I don't have to wrap it in args and keyword args. Yeah, see, there we go. So you can see it's calling that API over and over and over here, and printing out all my tweets. And you can see, since this is the raw response object that I'm printing out, I should have called this tweet response here because it's not the actual raw tweets. At some point here, it's going to say that I'm calling it oh, I guess this endpoint does let you do more than 15. And we could actually return all of my tweets. So anyway, I think that's about as far as we're going to get on this today. Like I said, not nearly as far as really, really cool applications of this. But we have basic interaction with the API. Maybe going forward, I'll start showing the extra features that you get access to when you have a user authenticate access to their user account through your app. And then we can get into all kinds of cool automation stuff, maybe leveraging some Azure services. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, I'll make sure I let you know when I'm coding live again and we'll take a look at it. But anyway, thanks for joining me today and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.